This session aligns with the goals of Independent Sector's Public Policy Committee, which is to educate and engage the sector on the ACE Act and philanthropy changes. This is part of a series of convenings, each framed through a different lens the sector is using to discuss the ACE Act. And today our focus will be looking at the ACE Act through an equity lens. Conversations about transparency and accountability in philanthropy, particularly regarding donor advised funds or DAFs, have been debated by the sector leaders and policymakers for the past 15 or more years. And in recent years, as the sector has prioritized equity in all aspects of our work, we began to apply it to these policies and practices of philanthropic institutions. The introduction of the ACE Act in June of this year have ignited a conversation about the role of public policy in advancing these conversations as it relates to philanthropy. And the goal of today's session is to help provide us with information and pose questions that continue the conversation about how public policy can drive equity in philanthropy. One of the fantastic things that we have in our conversation here today is we have a distinguished group of speakers who represent various parts of our sectors, and I'll introduce them shortly. Throughout any point in our conversation, please feel free to share your thoughts in the chat or submit a question in the Q&A box. I also want to let you know that let the participants know that this event will be recorded and posted to Independent Sector's website as well. So now that we've rounded our approach, I'd like to ask our panelists to introduce themselves. Please turn on your cameras, panelists, as you do so. And as our panelists come on board, our three distinguished speakers include Roger Colombo, Professor of Law at Columbus School of Law at the Catholic University of America, Lori Perlberg, Mott Chair of Community Relations at the Lilly School of Philanthropy and Indiana University, and Marlon Williams, Vice President of Collaboration and Policy, Philanthropy, New York. Marlon, I'm going to turn to you if you want to say a couple words with this introduction, and then we'll turn to Lori and then Roger.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. Again, my name is Marlon Williams. I work with Philanthropy in New York as the Vice President of Public Policy and Collaboration. And what that means in English terms is that I work on thinking about how does the philanthropic sector, particularly looking at those institutions operating in and around the New York area, both city, state, and the tri-state region, engage in effective collaborations, think about public policy, and think about the role that they can play in terms of really being in alignment with their mission, with the mission that they have. One of the key values that we hold at Philanthropy in New York is around equity. And so thinking about what are the strategies, policies, collaborations, interactions, and really cultural change that's needed within our sector that can support the most effective forms of philanthropy that help us to create the type of world we all want to live in. So that is the primary work that I do. And so I'm really excited to be able to have this conversation about some of the proposals and really the bigger questions around what are we doing to live into, to use our resources in a way that can live into creating a world that is much more equitable.
Thanks so much, Marlon. Lori?
Good afternoon, everyone. Pleased to be here. My name is Lori Perlberg, and I have the pleasure of being a professor of philanthropic studies at the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis. And I have the pleasure of serving as the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation Chair on Community Foundation. So put all those words together and try to introduce yourself. You should see my business card some days. So I study community-based philanthropy, institutional philanthropy, United Way's community foundations that are place-based. Much of my research is focused on equity and justice philanthropy, and I'm currently working with a large team of scholars in the US and 3 other countries that are looking at the move to justice-based philanthropy. So thank you for having me.
Thanks so much. And Roger, as you introduce yourself, we'll also ask you to introduce the ACE Act as one of the primary co-authors as well. So Roger, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Seyron, and thank you for inviting me. It's great to be here. So yes, I'm Roger Colombo. I'm a professor of law at the Catholic University here in Washington, DC at their law school. And for many years, I was also a counsel at the Joint Committee on Taxation at the US Congress, a nonpartisan outfit, and I helped to draft the tax policy for nonprofit organizations. And say, Ron, you're too generous saying I was a co-author of the act, but I've certainly am a founding member of the initiative to accelerate charitable giving and have been involved in a lot of discussions about the ACE Act. So with that, I will again, thank you and start with my initial job here, which is to provide an introduction to some of the key proposals of the ACE Act. And I want to start just by setting the stage with a little bit of context. So the ACE Act is designed first and foremost to restore the charitable giving incentives so they better serve their intended purpose. And what I'd like you to think about is what the giving incentives are for fundamentally. And the federal government is providing significant tax benefits for two main purposes. And the first one is to encourage gifts by donors, right? We want donors to part with their resources. The second one is for funds to get to working charities so that working charities can then use those funds in furtherance of their mission, which is what then serves the public interest. So these are what I think of as the twin purposes of the giving incentives. And the problem that the ACE Act is designed to address is really the problem of charitable intermediaries, which are donor-advised funds and private foundations. So when a donor makes a gift to an intermediary, the funds stay with the intermediary, and the charitable purposes can't be achieved until the funds leave the intermediary and get to a working charity where they can be put to charitable use. So intermediaries frustrate the goals not only because they delay the charitable benefit, but also because gifts to an intermediary allow donors to retain some control over the funds, which means they haven't completely made a gift, even if legally they're considered to have parted with their resource. So could I start with the next slide, please? So to give some context to charitable giving and giving to intermediaries, it's good to start with where we are as a nation in terms of how much we give. And there's this statistic which shows that giving remains fairly constant over time. And you can't probably read the fine print, but it's back down to 1979 to the present day. We see that giving is about 2% of disposable personal income of individuals, which means that really individuals don't give much more or less over time. It's stubbornly locked at that 2% number. And in fact, in the last couple of decades, during the rise of donor-advised funds, we haven't seen an increase in giving as a percentage of DPI, but rather a slight decrease. So in short, there's no evidence at all that donor-advised funds or private foundations are actually leading to an increase in overall giving. Rather, giving appears to be fairly constant. Next slide, please. And you take that into account and you ask where the giving is going. And if you go back to 1991, you see that 5% of individual giving goes to a charitable intermediary, namely to private foundations. If you fast forward 3 decades later to the present day, we've gone from 5% of charitable intermediary giving to 28% or 26% of charitable intermediary giving. So donor-advised funds, which didn't really exist in 1991, now take up 13% of all individual giving. Private foundations take up 15% of individual giving, which means more than a quarter of all gifts are going to intermediaries, which means that more than a quarter of all gifts are not fulfilling the main purposes of the charitable deduction upon the gift. Next slide, please. So this is really what the ACE Act is intended to address. And the ACE Act has main proposals directed to donor-advised funds and foundations. So the donor-advised fund provisions would impose time limits on advisory privileges. So the general rule would be that a donor has not unlimited advisory privileges as under present law, but must complete their gift within 15 years. After that, they no longer have an advisory privilege, and they would still have full tax benefits. Alternatively, a 50-year advisory privilege would be available so long as the donor delays the charitable deduction until the time that the funds actually come out of the donor advised fund. There is also an exception for the small accounts and the endowed accounts at qualified community foundations, which are really mission-driven DAF sponsors that serve a geographic region of 4 states or less. Next slide, please. The ACE Act also contains a rule on complex assets. I don't know how much we'll get into that in this session, but it is important from an equity perspective. And the rule of the ACE Act is that donation of these complex or hard to value assets is based not on the appraised fair market value, but is based on the amount that actually lands in the DAF and that is available for charitable use. Next slide, please. The ACE Act also contains provisions on foundations that affect the private foundation payout. And here it's important to think about what the purpose of the foundation payout is, right? So foundations have to pay out that 5% minimum by law per year. And the reason is that we want foundations to be actually providing a current benefit to charity. And that's really what gives foundations legitimacy. The trouble under current law is that it's too easy for foundations to avoid making a payment that goes directly for the benefit of a working charity. So the ACE Act would provide that transfers from a foundation to a donor advised fund don't count towards the charitable payout unless the money comes out of the DAF by the end of the year following the contribution year. And secondly, the ACE Act also has a proposal that says payments by the foundation for compensation or travel of foundation insiders, such as family members and relations of the donor, also do not count towards the charitable payout. Those payments are still allowed if they're reasonable, but they don't count towards the payout. Next slide, please. And then finally, on the foundation provisions, the ACE Act contains incentives for foundations to pay out more than the 5% minimum. So one incentive is that if in a given year a foundation pays out 7%, then the foundation would owe a 0% excise tax on its investment income for that year. And there's another incentive for foundations that are set up with a limited life of only 25 years. They would have a 0% excise tax, which would be permanent. So they would never have to pay that tax. So these are both incentive provisions that are intended to encourage foundations to pay out more. So there's plenty more in the ACE Act, but I just wanted to give you that thumbnail sort of skeleton before we now turn back to Seiran and open it up for more discussion.
Thanks, Roger. I feel like I just got a great primer. And so that was really helpful for all of us as we enter this conversation and invite our speakers to turn on their cameras and join us here on this front. You touched on this, Roger, in your presentation about where you saw some of the equity elements of the ACE Act. And so I'm curious to hear from our panelists overall. First of all, how are you defining equity? Because I think sometimes we may be working with different definitions. And secondly, where do you see that definition of equity intersecting with the ACE Act itself? And I should be upfront that, from at least my training and development, like for me, equity has been about shifting power and resources. And so I'm curious to hear from you, Lori, what's the definition of equity that you're working under, and how does it intersect with the ACE Act?
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest challenges that we have right now in the field is that the field is prioritizing equity and justice. But as you alluded to, Seiran, we don't have a clear definition. Sometimes we have competing definitions, overlapping definitions. So my definition of equity comes from this other academic hat that I have, and that's as a public affairs scholar. And so for me, coming from public affairs, there are equity is the distribution of something relative to some standard of need. So it differs from equality, which is an egalitarian outcome, and refers to the distribution of something relative to some kind of differences. So from my perspective, there are two dimensions to equity. The first is the distribution of resources, and I think there are two sub-dimensions to that. One is actually where foundation resources are located, who's holding them, and the second is how those resources are then distributed to the public, the allocation of resources. And in my space, I'm oftentimes looking at how community foundations are distributing grants, to what communities, to organizational types, to causes. However, I think that there's a second dimension, and that's closer to the shifting of power. And that is the process. To what extent we have equity in process. There's both an internal dimension, who's making decisions within the organization, to what extent donors, and I think this is where we intersect really closely with the ACE Act, to what extent donor advised funds and elite donors are controlling the distribution of assets versus the organization or the broader community. And then there's an external dimension, and that's participatory grant making in communities.
Thanks so much, Lori. Marlon, you started your introduction about the values at Philanthropy New York, and equity being one of them. So what's the working definition for equity at Philanthropy New York, and what's the intersection with the ACE Act?
Yeah, you and I actually share the definition. I think we've gone to a couple of Race Forward conferences together. And for me, equity is really about shifting power. But taking a step back, it's understanding that in the philanthropic sector, we actually are a sector that is about great inequities, right? It's through the amassing of tremendous amounts of wealth and then the attempts to redistribute it. Like, we are a sector created through inequities. And so as we think about what does equity look moving forward, it's about understanding and interrogating, where did that wealth come from? How is it being used? Because it's part of a social contract. We are part of, our sector is a part of a social contract that says that folks with great wealth in exchange for certain benefits get to make some choices around the allocation of those resources. So I really hold that equity is ultimately about the shifting of power. I think that involves both a process, so how there can be equity in the process of shifting power, who gets to decide how who's at the table and how those decisions get made. And then also there's equity in the outcomes, who's impacted, who benefits, who loses. And so there's always those two dimensions, similar to what Lori said, that I try to analyze both in the process of doing something and in the outcomes and impact it ultimately has. I think for the ACE legislation as proposed, it's actually, for me, combines a number of different conversations and questions, and in some ways, it differs a little bit on that question of the process pieces, because it looks at some systemic elements, but it really goes deeper down to the individual decision making. And so we always have to think of the levels at which equity works. Equity can happen within a system, right? So like how we as a full system work on it. Equity can happen at the level of the individual, right? Like, who gets to show up? What are the choices that individual donors or individual donors are making about their allocation of resources, and trying to think through what level you're operating on. And so I think that in many ways there's questions to be asked about what level ACE wants to work on, in terms of, is it trying to reform institutions? Is it trying to do a systems approach? Or is it really trying to change the individual decision making that folks are making? And I think within all of this, I try to make sure that equity, when I say equity, I often explicitly mean racial equity, because there are many different dimensions of identity that we can explore, that we can talk about, that within which there's inequalities and inequities in terms of the outcomes and who gets represented and who gets seen. But what we know from the data is that no matter what dimension you use, if you add race to it, it always becomes worse. And so by starting first with racial equity, I feel it's an effective way to lead this conversation. And we always at Philanthropy New York have a race and conversation, where it's like we start with racial equity and then we explore the other dimensions, but we always center and prioritize racial equity first.
That's really helpful, Marlon. And Roger, you previewed this in your presentation about the intersections with equity, and would love to get a further dive into that preview that you prepared us for.
Well, thank you. I guess one of the benefits and burdens of going last on this question is now I have to try to improve on the two definitions of Lori and Marlon, and I'm not sure that I can, because I think my definition shares a lot of the elements of theirs. Mine might be slightly more egalitarian than Lori's, but I guess when I think of equity, the first thing that comes to my mind is fairness, fairness and actually equality, and that we ought to be treating people equally, which gets me to think a little bit about equal opportunity, which brings me back to the idea of equity as process. So we want to make sure that all individuals have a similar shot at the resource, and that the process is fair and open and equal. But at the same time, I think there is equity in outcomes, which is you can have a perfectly fair process, but then when you look at the outcome of that process, it seems disproportionate and unfair, which really gives equity more of a normative component, because when we look at an outcome and think, gosh, one person got 100 and another person got 0, that doesn't seem fair. That other person should have more. So I think we have to look at equity from a process point of view and an outcome point of view. And that really fits into the charitable giving incentives, because I think when I think about equity, I think about donors. So are we treating all donors the same? Do all donors have similar access to the tax benefits? Do all donors get similar benefits when they do take a charitable deduction? So I think that's important on the process side in terms of the benefits that we're handing out. And I think also on the outcome side, we have to think about equity from a sector standpoint, which is, are all the charities and the charitable organizations getting essentially equal access to donor dollars? And are they really being well represented in the charitable sphere? And are we getting the sort of pluralism that we want out of the charitable tax benefits? So I think we have to look at it both from the donor side and the charitable organization side to see if these are equitable outcomes.
I would love to just dive into the outcome side of that question, right? Because part of the bill is designed to accelerate the distribution of grant making, essentially, from donor advised funds and private foundations through the various incentives you described. And so I'm really curious, Lori, if we put in more money into the system, right? What might we look like? What might the outcomes look like in terms of where that money may go? Do we know if the equal opportunity argument, right, is going to be there? Do we know that who's going to be in receipt of those dollars, generally speaking, from the trends we have? Would love to hear more on what happens if we put more money into this system and who's going to get that money.
Yeah, so, I've been billed as the person who has the data, but actually, really, I'm the person who is just going to say what data we don't have. So I think one of the things is there have been some estimates to try to figure out who are DAF holders, because I think this goes back to one of the points that Roger made about equity and who holds DAF. So there was a study about 5 years ago that looked at the average contribution to a DAF to try to estimate the income level of DAF holders. And so the estimate was that the average DAF holder has an income of somewhere between $1.3 and $2.1 million. And obviously, this is based on a lot of assumptions. But if we were to take that, then we're going to agree that most DAF holders are high net worth, very affluent donors. And so I think to best understand how accelerating their funding would have an impact, what impact that would have, we need to go back and look at past behavior. And if we look at studies of high net worth donors and where they make contributions, although this is going to speed up intergenerational equity to the current generation, I don't think that we have any indication that it's going to accelerate giving to marginalized communities. Most donors, including high net worth donors, give to those organizations and causes that they're already familiar with. However, being an optimist, I think that we do have some indication that maybe this is shifting slightly. So there was our 2021 study that just came out at the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy looking at high net worth donors suggests that 11% of affluent households reported making a donation to a Black African American cause, and that was up from 6% in 2017, but certainly not startling, not leading to a groundswell. And about 1/5 of affluent respondents reported giving to racial or justice issues. So basically, I'm not optimistic that we're going to see a huge shift in the patterns of giving that are coming out of DAFs unless we somehow restructure who gets to hold a DAF.
That's really fascinating. And that recalls actually a report that I saw from Dr. Cheryl Dorsey at Echoing Green last year, looking at the trends and patterns. And so, Roger, would just love your thoughts. And you've written a lot about these subjects, and you prefaced your comments earlier on the different levels of outcomes. Where do you have some insights in terms of what this might look like in terms of the actual grant making and how it speaks to the equity and distribution and opportunity, perhaps?
So I find this one hard to answer, I think, because for the reasons Lori suggested, is I don't know that we know that if we accelerate distributions out of intermediaries, where that money is going to go, or if it's going to be any different from the normal pattern of donation. So I think it's hard to predict. But what I would say is that if we're accelerating donations out of intermediaries, that promotes access to dollars. It means that there is more money coming out. So there is more opportunity to get money. And there's reason to believe that charities that need it will receive it. But I think it's hard to say what the data shows on that. But what I think is really important to focus on is not so much the acceleration or the money coming out, but it's rather to focus on what is happening inside the DAF from an equity perspective, because that's where I think where it really matters. And so just give me a second here, because when you think about DAF giving, 1 out of every $8 is going into a donor advised fund. So that's a very significant percentage. And once that money is in a DAF, it can remain there indefinitely. There is no requirement that it come out. And once it's in the DAF, it remains subject to the effective control of the donor. So what we're saying is that money in DAFs and foundations, for that matter, are accumulated assets that remain under effective donor control. And when you talk about the significant buildup or accumulations of wealth in these intermediaries, what you're really talking about is a massive power shift. And we see that there's a power shift away from working charities and towards donors, because this 25% of giving to charitable intermediaries is an accumulation of charitable wealth that remains under the thumb of the donors and outside of the use of working charities. So that is a power imbalance with respect to charitable dollars that I think is extremely important. And when you layer on top of that, the consideration that Lori just gave us, which is to try to identify the character of a DAF donor, or for that matter, any itemized donor. And what we know is that donors who itemize tend to be the wealthiest, right? They're at the top of the income spectrum. Lori just said that most DAF donors probably have incomes of above $1 million. And yes, I think we can presume that most of those donors are predominantly white. And so what we're talking about essentially are giving unlimited privileges to wealthy white donors in DAFs who retain control over massive accumulated sums. And I think it's very important to see what could be going on here in the aggregate, which is when we talk about a wealth gap in this country, which we often do, we talk about a racial wealth gap. I think within charities, we could be seeing a new charitable racial wealth gap, because the assets that have accumulated in these vehicles are a form of wealth. Right. And so when you think about Bill Gates, for example, often a good example to use, a very wealthy man, think about the Gates Foundation. Well, it's true, he doesn't own the funds in the Gates Foundation, but I think we'd all agree that being able to control the distribution of those resources is an important part of wealth and power. And so when we see donor advised funds, and foundations now controlling $1.2 trillion worth of money. This is effectively money that is very powerful, a very useful resource, and is under the control of donors effectively. And one final point before I stop here, I think going to equity as well, which makes this situation worse, is that DAFs are fundamentally not transparent vehicles, right? As soon as the money goes into a DAF, it is shielded from view by the DAF sponsor. There is no reporting at the account level. We don't know what is going on or who is benefiting from any individual DAF. And if you think that transparency and equity go hand in hand, DAFs are non-transparent, which I think then also affects the equity of outcome, because it's very hard to know what the outcome is of having these accumulations when they're accumulating inside non-transparent vehicles. So I think it's important to focus not just on accelerating money out of these vehicles, which serves one of the fundamental goals of the giving incentives, but also focus on what's happening by allowing these accumulations to go on and who is advantaged by that and how it affects power dynamics.
Thanks so much, Roger. And Marlon, you represent an organization that has one of the oldest community foundations in the country, the New York Philanthropic Trust, and so the Community Trust, excuse me, among others. And we'd love your thoughts and reflections on this conversation that you've heard from Lori and Roger in terms of equity and its connections here. And you had mentioned when you were describing your definition of equity is like, what are we talking about in terms of what level of systems and where we're engaged in? And I think we've heard several levels thus far. And so would love your thoughts on this piece here around all the aspects of equity, transparency, and donors, and who's giving.
Yeah, thank you so much for that invitation. First, I'd like to start out by recognizing that in this conversation, we're primarily talking about institutional philanthropy, which is kind of philanthropy that's been authorized under the tax code and like has all these frills around it. And in many ways, we are ignoring the philanthropy that happens between individuals and that happens primarily in communities of color. That is between individuals. It is the time, it is the resources, it's the care that happens in community. And I know, and I feel that many times those efforts go unseen because our system doesn't see that work. And so I just want to make sure we take a moment to recognize that philanthropy is not just about institutional philanthropy, but it's something that exists in all in all cultures and has existed over time. And when to recognize, particularly in communities of color, it's been a long-standing practice, even without the kind of like formal structures and the tax benefits, frankly, that go with it. Another point I think is important to identify around this question of accelerating giving and whether that's connected to charity, connected to equity, is that I firmly believe that equity and fairness are actually not connected ideas. Sometimes in order to achieve equity, you have to do things that may feel unfair because it's particularly those who have had power and privilege in the past. The seeding of that can feel unfair, but it's actually in the effort to shift power within the process and to shift power within the outcome. So I very much hold that equity does not always feel fair, and we can work with those feels, but it needs to be really grounded in the history of how we got to the moment. I think when we talk about equality, you can kind of speak about equality as a point in time, but equity really has to have an acknowledgement of where resources came from, what has happened, and how we got to this moment in order to figure out what is an equitable solution going forward. And sometimes the things that you do to be fair can really serve as impediments to equity. And I invite folks to really have questions about where did the wealth come from? What are the agreements that were made? And how do you move forward in a way that actually shifts power? And if you're doing a thing that doesn't shift power, then you aren't doing equity. It's always my rule of thumb. It's like, is there a shift in power that has happened? And power being the ability to like shape reality. Do people who are living in communities, do they feel a change? And if there hasn't been a change felt, then equity really hasn't happened. And I'd also want to try to distinguish the idea of opportunity and equity. What we want to make sure that happens in this space is that we are really about shifting shifting power and shifting processes, and creating more opportunity is necessary, but also insufficient for creating more equity. You need to make sure that have the questions about to whom these resources are going. And I think Laurie's data really points out for us that money in many ways flows like water, right? It goes towards the point of least resistance, and there are already established ways in which financial flows have gone traditionally, and turning on the pipe more does not necessarily mean it's going to go to those BIPOC community centered foundations or go to different places. It might just mean more money going to the same places that have created some of the inequitable situations we have now. So I think it's really incumbent on efforts or legislation that's trying to make a shift that's shift for equity, that we ask the question, who benefits, who wins, who loses, and who wins and loses, accepting that that when you have a shift of equity, there's going to be some winners and losers. Though collectively, we actually all win, because inequity keeps us from being the best of our whole self. Though within that, I recognize there's going to be individuals' senses of gain or benefit. And so I think these are some really critical questions to think about in this legislation or anything that comes out. Who is going to benefit? Are we doing opportunity, or are we actually doing the fine-tuning work of figuring out, like, how do we get it to the places that it has not gone before? It is a marked difference to have more of a thing than to have more of a thing that goes to places that have been under-resourced. It is a difference to have more decision-making ability, because what we do in philanthropy is we essentially say we're making it a social contract, where those who've been able to gain great wealth within our system get to make independent decisions about how those resources are allocated. And because we believe that sometimes that means that those at a local level or individual level can see what's happening on the ground and really plug into those places where there may be gaps in the ability of government to step in, or ways in which the market might not actually be functioning effectively. But within that, we have to make sure that, like, we're not just doing the things that have are most easeful to do, but we actually have fundamental shifts in both the incentives and the direction and the flow of those resources. So these are questions I really want everyone who's kind of analyzing the legislation and analyzing ways forward to think about what is equity actually, who benefits, how is it going to flow, and how do we actually take into account the history of what has happened before in terms of figuring out what we can do going forward.
Thanks. Go ahead, Roger, please. Yes, please.
I think what Marlon has just said is really important and really insightful, and it's hard to see it, I guess, within the context of the charitable giving incentive. So he's presenting a very, very big picture problem about where does the money go, and I think in terms of trying to frame this conversation around the ACE Act. Typically and historically, the charitable deduction has been cause neutral, which is to say just about any sort of organization can form under 501c3, and we don't really pick winners and losers based on what the cause of the entity is. So if we started to have giving incentives that favored particular causes based on a conception of equity, that would be a very, very dramatic departure from the way we approach giving incentives, which isn't to say we shouldn't do it or shouldn't think about it. But I think it is to say that the ACE Act isn't addressing that sort of a disparity, and it's not pretending to, right? I think what the ACE Act is doing is really focusing more on a problem that if we assume that we have a cause neutral giving incentive, the problem with the current neutrality is that it's actually tilted in favor of donor and donor privileges and against working charities, right? So if, at least at the outset, we can agree that the point of the giving incentives is to get money to charities that do the work, which would be a lot of money, charities that serve equitable causes. The problem that we're trying to address in the ACE Act is that it's right now the current system is too tilted in favor of donor privileges away from working charities, and that's the problem that it's trying to address.
Marlon, do you have a response to that, or Lori, a response to that?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question about the tilt between privileging foundations over donors. And for me, I think I always go back to what is the original like social contract that we have, which is about we have a system that allows for the accumulation of wealth, and if we're going to do that, like we believe that some of those resources through our tax code should be reinvested towards the whole. And so I think having a choice between the foundation piece or the individual donor piece feels like a little bit of like a false disparity, because it's overall about like what is the impact that this is going to have. There are different vehicles, and I think that there's very legitimate reasons to go through the foundation route or go through a DAF route, because they there are different technical machine mechanisms for like moving things forward. And so it's not about exactly the machinery of how, but for me it's like, what is the impact, and who has and is there going to be shifts in say in the process between as it relates to the public and the public good.
And I'm also mindful that when we talk about shifting power, that as the power of the moderator, I get to ask questions. And so I want to make sure, first of all, that our participants listening in, please do put in questions that you may have in the chat box, and we'll definitely ask them. And we aren't just holding time at the end. Certainly, as we get questions in, I'm working them into what we're asking our distinguished panelists here. So please do go ahead and put in some of your questions as you hear this conversation. And then the other point I just wanted to follow up on, Marlon used your term BIPOC, and I just want to clarify for folks who may not understand that reference. It stands for Black, Indigenous, and People of Color communities. So I just wanted to clarify those 2 points there on that front. Just turning back to this conversation, what I think I'm hearing is, and Roger, I just would love this as we talk about other aspects of the ACE Act, right? I think one of the pieces was around the use of private foundations to give to a community foundation, for example. And part of what we've heard from some organizations, some private foundations, is that that's meant to prevent any potential tipping issues with regard to supporting smaller community-based organizations, where a large potential infusion of grants from one organization may trigger the tipping rules that the IRS has. And so I think this relates really to this conversation that we've been having about who's getting the money and what will happen overall in the system. I'm curious to hear from you in terms of, from your research and from your work and writings on this, is that something that you and others are concerned about in terms of potentially triggering, the public support test?
Yeah, so this I think this refers to a part of the ACE Act that is gets very, very into the weeds very quickly in terms of trying to describe it, but essentially there's a part of the ACE Act that really follows up on a proposal that the Treasury Department was concerned about a while ago, which is the ability to use DAFs to create what I'll call phony public charities. So essentially, if a donor gives money to a DAF, and then the DAF gives money to a charity, and that charity's only source of support is the DAF, under the normal rules, that charity should be a private foundation. But because the money's coming from a DAF, it's treated as all good public support, which allows it to become a public charity. And so DAFs facilitate getting around the private foundation rules. And so that is the concern that the ACE Act is directed to preventing. So I think then your question is more about, or is related to that, and it maybe comes in a couple ways, which is, our foundations, if the ACE Act were to become law, are foundations somehow going to be inhibited in their ability of funding community-based organizations? And I think the answer to that is essentially no, but for a couple of reasons. One, foundations can fund these organizations directly. There's nothing that stops them from doing that. Two, under the public support rules as they exist, it could well be that these foundation grants are unusual grants, which means they don't count for purposes of the public support test. So it shouldn't actually affect their underlying status. Three, I think if it did turn out that this small community-based group is actually only getting funding from the foundation, then it ought to be a private foundation. And then in fact, these rules are being used to get around the private foundation rules. And in fact, foundations could even be using DAFs to avoid expenditure responsibility. So I think that's something else. And then finally, there's a concern, which I just want to address, is that private foundations do use community foundations, and there's nothing in the ACE Act that would prevent that. So what the ACE Act says is that a foundation to DAF transfer does not count for purposes of payout if the money doesn't come out of the DAF by the end of the year following the contribution year, which means that if a foundation transfers to the DAF, and then the money comes out of the DAF, if it's a DAF at a community foundation, and then it immediately goes, essentially within a year or more, to this local group, the foundation can do it and count it for purposes of the payout. And foundations also have the option of just making an outright grant to the community foundation. So I think there are all kinds of ways that this funding could survive kind of this anti-abuse rule.
Yeah. For me, I think within this piece is trying to understand the complexity of the philanthropic sector, the ways in which there are different organizing ways in which institutions can be organized, and also when I read through the legislation, there's this underlying assumption that, like, if I don't know what's happening, then it must be bad. Is a little bit of what comes through, and I think there's much more information that needs to be learned about how things are actually operating now. And because folks can do a thing doesn't mean that they are necessarily doing that thing. And trying to understand, are we addressing issues as they exist right now, or are we actually trying to address issues as we could imagine them? And there's one level of effort in trying to address the things that could be imagined, and there's not a level of effort in trying to address the things that we are actually experiencing right now. And I think there's a lot of data and knowledge to be gained from the practitioners in the field, both at the foundation level and how individual donors are doing their work, to really understand, like, what parts of the possibility are real things that we need to be working towards correcting and addressing, and also recognize the ways in which I think we are in unprecedented times. The combination of the COVID pandemic and the racial justice uprisings have really caused a lot of conversations within the sector about how they shift power, about how they think about their relationship to donors and to nonprofits who are doing the work on the ground, and the power relationship between those nonprofits and those donors themselves. And I think that there is space to gain more knowledge and to recognize the increases in giving that's happened, the changes in those power dynamics, and try to make sure that we put together and put forward a strategy that's really about addressing the issues that we know today, and that we know today, and that we can clearly foresee are in the future. I come from a government background, and I know that it's incredibly hard to create a new thing, and it's actually 3 times as hard to try to correct the thing after you put it in place. So I want to make sure that we're answering and addressing the right questions and addressing real questions. And that, for me, doesn't always feel clear within the legislation as it's put together now. And so I think there's lots of really great input to be had, and I'm really excited about the way in which the field has been energized and is responding to the question of equity, not necessarily of the ACE legislation, but the question of, what does equity mean? What does it mean to have outsized power that gives you tremendous amount of privilege, and how do you actually use that in a way that is in alignment with a social contract that says that we are about trying to make a better collective society, and understanding that that effort has not resulted in fair outcomes for all, and has not resulted in full inclusion in that process. what's changes that we could do that shift that flow of money and shift the flow of resources? And what do we need to know? What questions do we need to answer? And what data do we need to make sure that we're answering the real challenges that exist within the sphere today?
Lori, I feel like the question is just begging, it's being turned to you. I mean, you started the conversation by saying, we actually don't have a lot of information about this. So, I'm curious, like, what do we need to know? Like, what would be ideal for us to collect information on, so that we can have a conversation that is rich with data points? And as a related question to that is that, there's this mystique of this absence of data overall. And so would just love your thoughts on that piece there. I think Marlon set you up for that quite nicely on the what do we need to know piece.
Yeah, thank you, Marlon. So, I've got an academic hat on, so I'll tell you what I would love to know as an academic as I enter into this conversation. First, at the most basic level, how are leaders in the field defining equity and justice, right? So I'm just going to lay that as a flat definitional piece. But if we get into hard data, one of the things that's really important for me, I think, and how I view equity is the distribution of grants and allocations, who's receiving them. Where are they located? Who's leading those organizations? What activities and missions are they addressing? I also really think it's important to get inside the black box of the organization. How are decisions made? How are they made internally? Who holds power? Not just compositional who, but what does the process look like? How inclusive it is? How are communities engaged? So I think that there is both what we would call hard quantitative data that we need to know about resources or resource distributions, but so much more that we need to know about the process. And Marlon alluded to this, we don't really know how decisions are made in organizations. And I think that putting the two pieces together would really help the community foundation field to better tell their story of what do community foundations do? How do they do it? Why are they important? And what are DAFs? How do they work? And what role can they play? So ultimately, not only am I in favor of getting more data, but also being able to help build the field and move the field forward. It's going to be a really hard process of field change. And I think we need more information about how that happens. So, and that's going to take a lot of trusted relationships.
That's really helpful, Lori, and that I think contextualizes some of your comments earlier too. Before we just ask another question and we take a step back and just look at the field overall, we did get a question in terms of an update on where ACE is presently. So Roger, I think that you're perfectly set up for that question, which is the question we received from the audience is, where does the ACE Act stand now? And could you provide an update on its progress? And before answering that, Roger, I think this is one indication that we did adhere to our promise to answer questions from the chat box. And I encourage you to continue putting questions into the chat box so we can ask our panelists. Roger, over to you.
Well, I don't want to pretend to be the lobbying expert on this. So I think I know there's interest on the House side in the ACE Act, and I think that's the next step would be to get a bill introduced on the House side. Obviously, there's interest on the Senate side. It's a bipartisan bill, and I think the goal would be to get bipartisan support on the House side as well. And frankly, I think even if you look at the short-term prospects, it's always hard to use a crystal ball on Capitol Hill. But I think fundamentally these issues are not going away. They just aren't. So if the bill doesn't pass in a month or 2 months, I think it's extremely important that we talk about these issues and they're not going to suddenly disappear. So I think the prognosis longer term is good.
But I think the questions that the bill raises are really important ones. And even though it's a bill, I think many people kind of see it as a bill about equity or a bill about DAFs. It's really many big questions folded into one piece of legislation, which for me is always a hard route forward. It's a question about like, how do people feel about DAFs and the ways in which you created this like mechanism for moving forward, for doing philanthropic work on an individual decision-making level. It's a question about how do we feel about payout rates? What's the speed of payout rates that feels appropriate to the current crises that we face, that we face in our country with climate change and racial justice and all the different like issues to which we can be directing resources. Like, it's a question about how do people feel about the rate at which those are going out and the way have gone out in the past, and the rate at which different charities have responded in these moments of crisis. It's really also a question about who gets to decide, who gets to make these decisions. Are we making, and what incentives are we putting in place? Because the incentives we put in place, both to make things easier or to make things harder, are really about directing decisions. But it's also connected to who gets to make those decisions and who gets to benefit from the impact of how these resources will be put together. And then ultimately, it's a question about how we feel about rich people, which I think is a question we're still grappling with. And like, and how do we put that in a social context of economic system that allows for the building of extreme wealth, and like what does it mean to try to make sure that some of that benefit, like the infrastructure for creating extreme wealth, is created by all of us. And so what portion of that is reinvested in the collective? What's the vehicle for doing that, and to whom does that reallocation of resources go to? There are some really big questions that the field is grappling with and actively engaged with. I think it's a conversation with the public that is to be engaged. And I think for those who have not taken a side for or against the legislation, it's for me less about the legislation, which tries to answer all these things together, but really trying to have a measured conversation about how do we take on each of these big questions and what's the right path forward to doing that. This is one opportunity, but is it the right opportunity that actually solves the right problems as we define it? And so, and for me, that's the bigger piece to be done for those trying to make a decision about how to move forward. What are the problems you're trying to solve? Is this the right vehicle? And will it actually achieve the outcomes you think you want to get, particularly if you're centering equity in the outcome the process and the outcome?
I'm going to be difficult for a moment and try to synthesize what I heard over this hour-long conversation or so before we close out. And I think what I heard from you, Marlon, is putting more money into the same system with the same outcomes based on what we know equitable. And I think what I heard from you, Roger, is perpetuating a system that privileges certain types of donors over others equitable. And I think what I heard from you, Lori, is we need more information to even make a call on what is equitable, because we have all these varying definitions. So one, is that a fair summation and synthesis of the hour-long conversation? And if it's not, what are the additions and corrections you would make to that? I'm going to start with you, Lori, first.
Well, as an academic, I'm always going to tell you we need to know more. So I think you're spot on.
Marlon?
I think my modification would be to, what's the problem we're trying to solve, and are we using the right tool? And to get clearer understanding and more information from Lori's perspective about the problem that needs to be solved before we even ask the question of, is this the right tool for getting there? And I think there's lots of valid questions about, is this the correct tool? I see some of the problems that it tries to ask. I'm not clear that all of those are real versus imagined. So we do need more information. But I think for individual organizations to really ask the question of like, what is the problem we as institutions, we as a field, we as a sector, and we as a collective are trying to solve in terms of the allocation of resources that we have, and what level do we need to work at to be most effective with that? And is this legislation currently as is, which tries to package together a lot of different things, really the best vehicle for doing that?
Marlon, I feel like that was your demand for me to be more nuanced. Roger.
Yeah, so I think it's partly I'm going to respond to Marlon a little bit, because I think a lot of what Marlon has been saying is very I'm trying to find the right adjective, because it's very compelling and very important. But I also think it's not really about the ACE Act, which is, I think, many of the very profound questions that Marlon is asking are very large, big picture questions that we need to ask as a society about big philanthropy and where the money is going and who controls the resources. And those are all important, interesting, vital discussions that we should be having and the policymakers should be having. But I don't think that that's fundamentally what the ACE Act set out to do. So I think it's important not to judge the ACE Act based on the criteria that Marlon has laid out. I think more important is to think about the problem the ACE Act is trying to solve, which is much smaller in scale, but still vital to the health of the charitable giving incentives. And really here, I'm a systems person, which is, maybe I could take my let's make everything work better hat off and get a more revolutionary hat on and say, let's just change the whole system. But I think given the system that we have, it's important to think about what are we trying to achieve within this given system. And the system was never set up so that individuals could give money, retain control over their assets, and working charities would not have access to those funds. That was not the intent of the giving incentives. It never has been. Private foundations were a compromise, and the way Congress decided to regulate them was to allow perpetual funds so long as they paid out a minimum amount for the benefit of working charities each year. Congress has never addressed this problem in donor-advised funds. They have grown up under an antiquated system of laws and essentially represent a loophole for donors to get around the completed gift rule, retain unlimited advisory privileges, and the funds are sitting there unavailable to any working charity. They can't be used on the balance sheet, they can't be borrowed against, they can't go into an endowment. They are just waiting for the donor to take action. And I think that's an irrational system. Now, we might want a completely different system, but I don't think that's the conversation of the ACE Act. I think the conversation of the ACE Act is to work within the existing system and make it work better.
Thanks so much, Roger. Lori, I'm going to give you the last word on this as we close out this discussion today. You've heard a lot of conversation. You've brought up the issue of data and the need for it and some of the current trends. What's your great hope for where the ACE Act goes in terms of sparking that conversation, especially with that public affairs scholarly hat you referenced frequently?
Sure. Well, I don't know that I can do justice to us, but I do think that we are at a tipping point moment. We have a really great opportunity to move the field forward. I agree with Roger that the ACE Act isn't a end all be all. It's a first step in trying to regulate DAFs and trying to get the money out the door. But I also agree with Marlon that we have huge issues about the role of philanthropy in our society and how to make structural changes perhaps within the philanthropic field. So I'm right there in the middle.
Thank you so much, Lori, Marlon, and Roger, for the conversation and for your time and expertise today. I just want to thank all of our participants for bearing with us as we got through the technical difficulties. And also to please use these last few minutes to fill out the post-event survey that is being shared with you in the chat. Your reactions and insights are critical as we move forward with this work. So thank you all for your time and expertise, and I wish you all a wonderful evening.